Okay, the other idea, just another Parker Palmer idea along these lines. How do you do this sort of thing? And it raises the question that was raised about, sort of what do teaching methods look like if you have the subject-centeredness? He's got a very interesting idea, which he calls teaching from the microcosm. Right? And it's hard to do justice to, but his idea, it comes from a little piece of a poem he quotes at the beginning of the chapter from William Blake, the English poet, which goes like this: to see a world in a grain of sand, a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. Lovely. What's he talking about? Well, that's important, right, to him in this idea of teaching from the microcosm, the world in a grain of sand, right? And he's got this idea that if you take something like that and you actually put it under the microscope, you literally take a grain of sand and put it under a microscope, all of a sudden an amazing variety and complexity unfolds before you that you can't even imagine. Right? If you take just a little taste of something, in it is going to be a much bigger world, right? So what he's trying to do is say that this model of the teacher-centeredness has been a content transmission kind of model, and that there's so much content that's being transmitted, it's sort of like a flood that overwhelms people. What he's trying to say is that if you take this approach, perhaps what we should do is actually do more with less, and actually hold up a grain of sand and see how much we can learn from just looking at the grain of sand. And what he means by that is, I'll give you some examples of what he means by that. Where did it go? Putting things under the microscope. He's got a nice little summary bit. Where did it go? Where did it go? He talks about literature. How come I can never find these things when I want to? Here we go. He says, every academic discipline has grains of sand through which its world can be seen. So he asked, why do we keep dumping truckloads of sand on our students, blinding them to the whole instead of lifting up a grain so they can learn to see for themselves? Why do we keep trying to cover the field when we can honor the stuff of the discipline more profoundly by teaching less of it at a deeper level? This is partly what I was driving at in my talking about over-content in church context as well, right? So here's some of his examples. No matter what great thing we are studying, there's always an equivalent to the stem section, his example of putting a flower under a microscope here, the stem section under the microscope. And here's those examples. In every great novel, there's a passage that, when deeply understood, reveals how the author develops character, establishes tension, creates dramatic movement. With that understanding, the student can read the rest of the novel more insightfully. Right? In every period of history, there's an event that, when deeply understood, reveals not only how historians do their work, but also illumines the general dynamics of that era. In every work of philosophy, there is a pivotal idea that, when understood deeply, reveals the foundations of his or her system, or non-system, he says, of thought. Right? So it's the idea of just taking the microcosm and seeing the vast implication of it. Right? Wouldn't that be more powerful than dumping lots of grains of sand on people? We have a lecture coming up this fall at Regent by a professor of music history from UBC, University of British Columbia, is across the street from us, and we have lots of connections. This is a professor of music history, he's a Christian, and I asked him to come do a lecture that he's famous for, which is the story of the Reformation, like what was the Reformation all about, told on the basis of just one hymn, Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." So this is the teaching from the microcosm moment. Partially why I want him to get to do this, not only because I love that hymn and I think the Reformation is very interesting, we're thinking about and even celebrating, but I want to get him in to demonstrate how to do this, right? As an example. So yes, there's a whole lot to say about the Reformation, and you can't say everything about the Reformation in a 1-hour lecture, but to use one example of one hymn, which you probably, most of you know, right? You know that hymn? Yeah. Right? So how is it that that's a microcosm of this bigger thing called the Reformation? Okay? I think it's really, really interesting. So pedagogically, I find that really interesting, as well as the actual content of it. That's the kind of thing that Palmer is talking about. Couldn't we do more with less? Interesting. Just an idea. So that's his idea of teaching from the microcosm. Various examples.